While all eyes have been on the reservation bill introduced in the Lok Sabha, there is another important bill that the Lok Sabha passed that deserves scrutiny. This week, the DNA Technology Regulation Bill 2018 was passed by the Lok Sabha and is pending approval in the upper house. The bill allows for DNA to be taken and stored in DNA banks and can be used in criminal cases and in some civil cases as well. Now, there has been a number of concerns raised regarding privacy and the possible misuse of DNA, among other things. The Minister for Science and Technology, Harsh Vardhan, attempted to allay these fears in Parliament. But are there enough safeguards in the bill to protect the rights of citizens? To talk more about this, I'm joined now by Advocate Murali Neelakantan, who has been arguing against the bill. We all read your piece on BloombergQuint.com as well, Murali. Were you convinced by Dr. Harsh Vardhan's speech in Parliament?
I don't think they've taken any of the feedback that we've given them. There have been several pieces written, but clearly we haven't got through to Parliament because all of those objections that I and many like me have tried to put out there, all we've got is one tweet from one member of Parliament in the opposition, and that's pretty much it. So all of our concerns still remain to be resolved.
Okay, let's break it down on what's in this bill and why there are concerns. It proposes setting up a national DNA bank, regional DNA banks as well. DNA will be collected with consent. Except if it's heinous crimes which are punishable 7 years or more. And stored in these banks. If you're absolved of whatever charges, then you have also a choice to remove your DNA from any of these databases. I don't see a problem so far.
So the challenge is that there will be lots of DNA in every crime scene. Until you determine who the villain is, all of those DNA samples will be in the database. So how do you sort out suspicious people, innocent people, victims, anybody else who could have been at the scene of the crime? So the danger is that you will have this huge repository of DNA which may not relate to the crime at all. And as this database becomes bigger and bigger, and as you start cross-indexing it with other samples, other people, you will now have a database that has nothing to do with crime at all.
Yeah, but you know, for the criminal justice system to use DNA to build a case, obviously it is commonsensical that if the scene of crime is a heavily populated place or where people are walking around, they will need to provide corroborating evidence. They can't say we had 100 fingerprints or 100 people's DNA samples and hence everyone is accused. It's going to go through a system of investigation, isn't it?
It should. There are no rules in the Evidence Act as to how to use DNA. So, for example, if there's a crime committed in a taxi cab, for example, I have just come in one, obviously my DNA sample is going to be there. Now, am I going to be a suspect in that investigation or not? How long until they confirm a charge sheet is filed? I may or may not be a suspect at that time. And until when do I have to say, please, I don't want to be part of this process because I have nothing to do with it. So what is going to be my corroboration? I'll have to find an alibi. So is everybody who has a DNA sample present at the scene of the crime now required to provide an alibi? That's not proving a crime. That's asking me to prove an alibi. Completely different.
Murali, they're using it the world over. In this taxi case that you've talked about, it could also so be that if there is a crime in this cab, the cab driver may have identified you. If you came in, one of those either Ola or Uber, there would be a complete track of where you were in any case. Are we fighting something that's already existing? For example, the minister says this law exists in 60 countries. People the world over use DNA to detect crime. Why should India not?
And we found too many mistakes have been committed and too many innocents have been sent to jail. So if you look at the United States, there's a long history of getting convictions wrong. And in one of the pieces on Bloomberg, we used this example of where it was incorrectly identified. Unlike fingerprints, which don't require a lot of high tech, picking up a sample requires a whole lot of technology. So, for example, the sample may be contaminated. Samples deteriorate. So a crime scene sample can, in many cases, and in most cases, especially in India, and we have lots of research on deterioration of samples, may not be the sample that matches. So you may have a match which is actually a false positive. So my sample being left out there or cleaned over by a disinfectant actually deteriorates the sample. Now when you get a match, what are you matching? So there's two problems with this. One is the sample really mine, or is it showing a false positive? Secondly, how is the sample being handled? Thirdly is the question of how does a judge evaluate evidence? It's assumed that DNA is science, but in a court it's actually statistics. So it is not a science, it's an opinion of somebody whether X matches Y. So you have three different sets of problems. Is that the sample that matches me? Is it really mine? Two, has it been collected in a manner that gives me enough comfort that it's followed a process that's scientific? And thirdly, how do you interpret this sample matching? It's only an opinion, statistically. And I don't think judges are aware of how to use this. They just think it's an open and shut case.
Just one more on this before we go to the civil concerns. But that is as fuzzy a piece of evidence as anything else which is available right now to investigators and police officers. My simple question, why not arm them with something that everyone has? Now, one of the things that the minister said in his speech was about missing children, for example. DNA banks could help identify who their parents are. Unidentified deceased people. People during calamities. I understand their concerns, but then their concerns with everything.
It's true. When people volunteer to do this, it's a completely different story. The Constitution says I don't have a duty to incriminate myself. In fact, I have a right against it. The prosecution has to prove its case. So we are in three different categories here: criminal law, civil law, and this issue that you talk about where there might be some social benefit to people volunteering their DNA to find a child or to find a lost relative. So there's three different problems here that we're trying to solve. Volunteering DNA to identify a deceased person doesn't require this legislation. My fear is they all go into one database. You give it for one purpose, it's going to be used for everything else. And in this country, things are porous. Databases have new lives and they come up in new avatars. We've seen that with Aadhaar. We suspect that we'll see the same thing here. So you submit DNA for one purpose, or it is found at a crime scene or somewhere else, and then it goes into this huge database, then is then used for everything else.
So let me continue to play devil's advocate. 15 years. This law has been making for 15 years. It has passed several levels of checks and balances and scrutiny. They talk about consent. They've given you an option to take your name out of the database. The only exception is for people who are allegedly have committed heinous crimes. So why not trust the system, and the kinks will work themselves out as in any new law?
The danger is that in this case, too many people are going to die before you decide that, oh, it doesn't work anymore. And at that point in time, we just refuse to look at it. So consent is, in this case, where in a criminal case consent is sought, it can be overridden by a magistrate. So what are you expecting? That let's assume that I'm a suspect, I refuse to give a sample. The magistrate says, no, I think you should give a sample.
He could say, no, I don't think you should either. I mean, it's left to the magistrate.
It's left to the magistrate. And the magistrate has no way of knowing one for another. He's not been educated in what the DNA does, how the evidence is to be collected. So first, he asks that the DNA be taken. Okay, then I object to the fact that the crime sample is contaminated. What does he say to it? He says, take the sample again. That's ridiculous. How can you take a crime sample again? How will you get fresh DNA out of a crime sample that's already contaminated? So it sounds a very nice thing to do, but if you look at the science and the law of it, it just does not work. This bill goes beyond DNA, and that's my major objection to it. It talks about taking photographs. Why do you need photographs of my bodily parts to take DNA? Why do you have to be intrusive in taking my DNA?
That is frankly a...
So there's a whole lot of it here that is scope creep. you don't require invasive procedures to get DNA consensually. And if that's the law, then I'm sorry, but it's against the Constitution.
What is the worst case scenario? What is the worst case scenario that you're painting for people to understand why you're so concerned? Because a lot of people, watching this will be thinking that, hey, this is what we've seen happening the world over. It helps in a lot of cases. It helps bring criminals to justice. There are social causes also. DNA is now being used extensively in the field of medicine and science. Yeah. Why should we hold back? So what is the worst case scenario that you would present as a counter argument to that?
The worst case scenario actually is that we have a database that's unmanageable and we're going to mine it for all the wrong reasons. That's my worst case scenario. All of our DNA potentially could be on that database because every crime scene sample is going to be on that database. DNA, unlike fingerprints, actually travels around. It travels in the air, it travels on clothes. I've left some around in the studio. It might stick to somebody else's clothes and go somewhere else. So unlike a fingerprint that doesn't travel, DNA actually travels. So you have lots of negatives sitting in that database that are going to start giving you false positives. It may never have come from the crime scene, but you have a sample that says it's a crime scene sample. It has nothing to do with the crime, but it will be on your database. Then to get it scrubbed off the database is virtually impossible. I don't know it's in the database, so I can't ask for it to be scrubbed. So you now have a creation of a database of DNA of this country.
No, but if suppose they have gone to a crime scene and they've found 100 samples, they have to go and take consent in writing from each person.
No, under this, any person who was present at the scene of the crime when it was committed, you'll only determine after somebody objects to it. So they already have the sample. It doesn't say there that you have to destroy the samples that they're not using in trial. So there is no way in which they're going to destroy any sample unless you petition them through an order of the court for the sample to be destroyed. Now, I don't know my sample is there. So how do I petition? So now you'll have a database which is there without my consent because they found my DNA sample all over the countryside. That's my biggest fear and what they're going to do with it.
So one point that the minister made in his speech was that he said that the DNA samples will not have any ability to, will not tell you details of caste, he mentioned, facial recognition or any other such traits, so you need not worry. Take us through that. You don't seem very convinced, and why don't you?
We're reconstructing Neanderthal faces using DNA samples.
Yeah.
So I guess the learned doctor needs to look at what we are doing with our histories. So if they can reconstruct a face from 30,000 years ago, I think they'll do slightly better with mine.
If this bill does go through, and there doesn't seem to be any great opposition to it, so no reason to believe it will not pass the parliamentary stage, what happens next? Do you think that there will be a legal challenge to it?
I hope there will be. This is not one of those cases where a PIL can be filed. I think the courts will be reluctant to allow a PIL on something like this. So it will probably require a test case of sorts. Somebody whose DNA is being used in trial will have to petition the court and say this is unconstitutional. We saw this with blood samples. The first time it happened was the case where blood samples were taken without consent. And I suspect the same arguments will be used here to say, oh, we're going to use it only in a few cases and we'll be careful about it, and it doesn't involve the right against incrimination. My challenge, though, is that this is really invasive. In the Indian context, it's even worse. In America, for example, the prosecutor has to place all evidence before the court and share it with the defense in advance. He can't take samples illegally. So we have what's called the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. We don't have that in India. We don't also have the duty of full disclosure. So if a DNA sample is taken and it actually exonerates me, in this country the prosecutor doesn't ever produce it. He only produces evidence that incriminates me. Those are the two big reasons not to use it in criminal justice in this country. those are the two reasons why it is easier to use it and more defensible to use it in the United States or the United Kingdom.
Just one word on the use of DNA for civil situations. Some examples of what these civil cases could be, and why is the concern? Because more people would end up being in this database for civil purposes than criminal, statistically. So that is actually the larger area to focus on. What are the concerns there?
First problem again is you go into a database. How do you get it back? You not only have your DNA there, with your DNA, you're effectively handing over the whole family's DNA there. So my brother, my parents, my children, all of them will be in that database. So the whole family, I might consent to it. Is my family consenting to it? Everybody up the tree and sideways from the family tree, are they consenting to it? So my big fear is once you get one member of the family, you've got the whole family. And that is generations of people up, all of their cousins and all of their children. So we're talking about a database that is going to grow exponentially, and what you do with it. So again, if it is paternity, for example, and where in a civil case you might say, we're fighting over property, is so-and-so the heir of X or Y? Parents might be easier. What about first cousins? What about second cousins who are fighting over, let's say, family property, HUF property, hereditary property? All of their DNA samples and all of their families' DNA samples are going to be in that database. I worry. Once you have a database like this, I fear that it will be used for reasons that it's not intended. We have a history of that in this country.
All right, lots to think about. Thank you so much, Murali, for speaking with us. The DNA bill has not got quite the attention it deserves, and come to think of it, we're all talking about one of the bills, like the reservation bill, which needs a constitutional amendment to include reservation for 10% of economically weaker section. What about DNA bill, which could potentially impact every Indian citizen? Something very important to really think about. Thank you so much for joining us.